The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Margaret Thompson adjusted her black robes. She had presided over countless cases in her 20-year career, but today felt different. The annual Veterans Day March was scheduled to pass right by the courthouse, and she could already hear the distant sound of drums and bagpipes echoing through the streets. Margaret had always respected military traditions. Her own father had served in the army. She understood the importance of honoring those who had sacrificed for their country. However, she also believed deeply in the rule of law and maintaining order in her courtroom as she walked toward her chambers. Her assistant, Linda, hurried to catch up with her. "Judge Thompson, there's something you should know about today's schedule," Linda said, slightly out of breath. "The march route has been changed at the last minute. They'll be passing directly in front of the main entrance during your morning session." Margaret frowned. The courthouse had strict policies about noise disruptions during proceedings. "Did they get proper permits for this route change?" she asked. "That's just it," Linda replied, shuffling through her papers. "The paperwork shows the original route, but the march organizers received different instructions yesterday. There seems to be some confusion about who authorized the change." Through the tall windows, Margaret could see crowds gathering along the street. Families with small children, elderly veterans in wheelchairs, and young people with cameras were all positioning themselves for the best view of the parade. The atmosphere was festive and patriotic, with American flags waving in the gentle breeze. But Margaret also noticed something else. Police barriers were being set up haphazardly, and traffic was backing up as drivers tried to navigate around the unexpected road closures. What should have been an orderly celebration was beginning to look chaotic. As she entered her courtroom, Margaret could hear the marching band getting louder. The deep bass drum seemed to vibrate through the floor, and she could feel the rhythm in her chest. Her first case of the day was a complex civil matter involving a property dispute between two longtime neighbors. It required careful attention to detail and clear communication between all parties. "All rise," called the bailiff as Margaret took her seat behind the bench. She looked out at the packed courtroom, noting that several people seemed distracted by the growing noise outside. The attorneys were shuffling their papers nervously. The plaintiffs kept glancing toward the windows. Just as Margaret was about to call the first case, the sound of marching boots became thunderous. The entire building seemed to shake as hundreds of uniformed service members passed by in perfect formation. Through the windows, she could see the precise movements of the honor guard, their rifles gleaming in the sunlight. Then, suddenly, the formation broke. One figure separated from the group and began walking toward the courthouse entrance. Margaret watched in surprise as a tall man in a crisp military uniform pushed through the crowd and headed straight for the building. The noise in the courtroom grew as people craned their necks to see what was happening. Margaret banged her gavel firmly. "Order in the court," she called out. But her voice was nearly drowned out by the continuing march outside and the murmur of confused spectators inside. The courtroom doors burst open, and the uniformed man strode in with purpose. His boots clicked against the marble floor as he walked down the center aisle, his eyes fixed directly on Judge Thompson. The gold braiding on his uniform caught the light, and Margaret could see that he wore the insignia of the Royal Guards, an elite ceremonial unit. "Your Honor," the man called out in a clear, strong voice that carried over the din. "I demand to speak." Margaret felt her patience wearing thin. The disruption was exactly what she had hoped to avoid, and now it was happening right in her own courtroom. The civil case would have to wait, and everyone present was staring at this unexpected interruption. "Sir, you're disrupting court proceedings," Margaret said firmly, raising her voice to be heard. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." But the guard didn't move. Instead, he stood straighter and looked directly into her eyes. "Ma'am, with all due respect, there's been a serious violation of protocol here today. The march route was changed without proper authorization, and it's created a dangerous situation for both the participants and the public." Margaret could see that he was serious, but she also knew that allowing disruptions in her courtroom would set a dangerous precedent. The rule of law had to be maintained, regardless of the circumstances or the good intentions of those involved. As she prepared to respond, She noticed something unexpected in the guard's demeanor. While his interruption was inappropriate, his bearing suggested someone accustomed to order and procedure. His words, though disruptive, were measured and respectful. There was something about this situation that didn't quite fit the pattern of a simple disturbance case. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Judge Thompson studied the uniformed man standing before her. Outside, the march continued, but the disruption had clearly affected the ceremony. She could see through the windows that other guards were looking toward the courthouse, unsure whether to continue or wait for their colleague. "State your name and rank," Margaret commanded, her voice carrying the authority of years on the bench. "Sergeant First Class David Chen." "Royal Guards Honor Unit," he replied crisply, maintaining his military posture. "Your Honor, I understand I'm in contempt of court, but I had no choice. There's been a serious breach of safety protocols." Margaret looked past him to see her bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, approaching cautiously. She held up her hand to signal him to wait. Something about Chen's manner made her want to hear more, even though every instinct told her to have him removed immediately. "Explain quickly," she said. "You have exactly 2 minutes before I hold you in contempt and have you arrested." Chen's eyes never wavered from hers. "Ma'am, the march route was changed yesterday without going through proper channels. The new route creates a bottleneck at 5th and Main Street, where construction has narrowed the road to 1 lane. We have over 300 veterans marching, plus families and spectators. If there's an emergency, there's no way for ambulances or fire trucks to get through," as if to emphasize his point. The sound of car horns began honking outside. Margaret could see frustrated drivers trapped in the unexpected traffic jam, and she noticed that several elderly spectators were looking uncomfortable in the growing crowd. "Furthermore," Chen continued, his voice gaining urgency, "the original permit specified police barriers every 50 feet. I've counted the barriers outside, and they're spaced at nearly twice that distance. If the crowd surges, people could get hurt." Margaret felt a flicker of concern. She had seen crowd control issues before, and they could turn dangerous quickly. But she also knew that this was highly irregular. A member of the military had no business interrupting court proceedings, regardless of his concerns. "Sergeant Chen," she said formally, "these are matters for the march organizers and the police department, not for my courtroom. You've disrupted legal proceedings and broken formation during an official ceremony." Chen's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained respectful. "Yes, ma'am. I understand that completely. But I tried to reach the march coordinator 20 minutes ago. His radio is malfunctioning. I tried to flag down the police supervisor, but he's dealing with a traffic accident on the other side of town. The march is continuing toward that bottleneck, and I estimate we have maybe 10 minutes before it becomes a serious problem." Through the courtroom windows, Margaret could see that. Chen was right about one thing. The crowd was growing denser as the march approached the narrower section of the route. She could also see that some of the older veterans were already looking tired and stressed by the unexpected delays and confusion. "Your Honor," Chen pressed on, "I took an oath to protect people, not just in combat, but always. I couldn't stand by and watch a situation develop that might hurt innocent civilians, especially veterans and their families." Margaret found herself in an impossible position. If Chen was right, there could indeed be a safety issue developing. But allowing a military member to disrupt court proceedings and dictate emergency responses would undermine the authority of the civilian court system. "Bailiff Rodriguez," she called, making her decision, "please escort Sergeant Chen to holding. I'm charging him with contempt of court and disruption of legal proceedings." Chen nodded once, accepting the decision with dignity. "I understand, Your Honor, but please at least call Captain Morrison at the police department. Ask him to check the barriers and the bottleneck at 5th and Main. If I'm wrong, I'll accept full responsibility for today's disruption." As Rodriguez approached with handcuffs, Margaret noticed something that made her pause. Chen wasn't resisting or arguing. Instead, he was calmly removing items from his pockets and placing them neatly on the table beside him, the way someone familiar with arrest procedures would do. "Sergeant," she said suddenly, "have you been arrested before?" "No, ma'am," Chen replied. But I've studied legal procedure extensively. I'm actually a third-year law student at the state university. I attend classes in the evenings and weekends when I'm not on duty. This revelation caught Margaret completely off guard. A law student would understand exactly how serious his actions were today. He would know the potential consequences of contempt charges, and he would certainly understand the proper channels for reporting safety concerns. The fact that he had chosen to disrupt her court anyway suggested that he genuinely believed the situation outside was urgent. Margaret felt her certainty wavering as she looked at this young man who was clearly intelligent, respectful, and committed to both his military service and his legal education. Officer Rodriguez. Wait, she said, raising her hand again. She turned back to Chen, studying his face carefully. If you're a law student, you know there are proper procedures for emergency situations. Why didn't you follow them? Chen's expression remained serious, but she could see a flicker of hope in his eyes. Ma'am, I tried. But sometimes the system moves too slowly when people's safety is at stake. I made a judgment call, and I'm prepared to face the consequences. But I couldn't live with myself if something happened that I might have prevented. Judge Thompson found herself at a crossroads that would define not just this moment, but potentially the trajectory of a young man's future. The courtroom was silent except for the muffled sounds of the march continuing outside, and she could feel the eyes of everyone present watching her next move. Officer Rodriguez. Please step back, Margaret said quietly. She turned to her court reporter. Please note that I'm temporarily suspending the contempt proceedings to evaluate the defendant's claims about public safety. She looked directly at Chen. Sergeant, I'm going to give you exactly 5 minutes to present your case properly. Pretend this is a legal brief and convince me that the immediate danger you describe justifies your extraordinary actions today. Chen's posture shifted slightly. The military bearing remained, but Margaret could see the law student emerging as he organized his thoughts. Your Honor, I respectfully submit 3 critical points that constitute an immediate public safety emergency. He began speaking with the precision, someone who had clearly thought through legal arguments before. First, the doctrine of imminent danger allows for extraordinary measures when normal channels would result in harm to civilians. The march will reach the bottleneck at 5th and Main in approximately 8 minutes. Based on their current pace, Margaret was impressed by his structured approach, even under these unusual circumstances. Continue, she said. Second, the modified route violates city ordinance for 7B, which requires adequate emergency vehicle access during public gatherings. The construction at 5th and Main reduces the roadway to 12 feet, below the minimum 14-foot requirement for emergency vehicles. As Chen spoke, Margaret could see through the windows that he was right about the timing. The front of the march was indeed approaching the area he had described, and the crowd of spectators was growing thicker. Third, Your Honor, the spacing of police barriers violates the safety parameters specified in the original permit. This creates what emergency management protocols define as a crowd compression risk, particularly dangerous for elderly participants and children. Margaret was struck by Chen's knowledge of specific ordinances and emergency protocols. This wasn't just a concerned citizen speaking. This was someone who had clearly studied both the legal and practical aspects of public safety. Sergeant Chen, she said, you seem remarkably well-informed about city ordinances for someone whose primary duty is ceremonial guard service. For the first time, Chen's formal composure cracked slightly, and Margaret caught a glimpse of something more personal. Ma'am, I've been studying public safety law as part of my specialization. After I graduate, I want to work in emergency management law, helping cities prepare for and respond to crisis situations. And you're willing to risk your military career and your legal future for this? Margaret asked. Chen's answer came without hesitation. Yes, ma'am. If I'm wrong about the danger, I'll accept full responsibility. But if I'm right and something happens because I stayed silent, I couldn't live with that. Just then, Linda burst through the courtroom doors, her face flushed from running. Judge Thompson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Captain Morrison is on the phone. There's been an incident at 5th and Main. Several elderly marchers have collapsed, and an ambulance can't get through due to the crowd congestion. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people realized that Chen's warnings had been accurate. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she understood how close they had come to a much more serious tragedy. "Bailiff Rodriguez," she commanded, "please contact emergency services immediately and have them establish alternate routes for medical vehicles." She turned back to Chen, who was standing quietly despite being vindicated. "Sergeant, it appears your assessment was correct. However, that doesn't automatically excuse the manner in which you brought this to my attention." Chen nodded respectfully. "I understand completely, Your Honor. I violated proper procedure and disrupted your court. The fact that there was a real emergency doesn't erase those actions." Margaret was struck by his maturity and legal understanding. Many people in his position would be demanding immediate vindication and praise for being right. Instead, Chen was acknowledging the complexity of the situation and accepting responsibility for his choices. "Tell me," Sergeant Margaret said, "in your legal studies, have you encountered the concept of civil disobedience and its place in the justice system?" Chun's eyes brightened with interest. "Yes, ma'am. The principle that individuals sometimes have a moral obligation to disobey unjust laws or procedures, while accepting the legal consequences of their actions. And do you believe that applies to your situation today?" Chen considered the question carefully. "Partially, Your Honor. I don't think the procedures themselves are unjust. They exist for good reasons. But I do think there are rare circumstances where immediate action is necessary, even when it means breaking protocol." Margaret found herself genuinely impressed by Chen's thoughtful response. He wasn't trying to excuse his actions or claim he was above the law. Instead, he was articulating a principled position that showed real understanding of both legal theory and practical ethics. Through the windows, she could see that emergency responders had arrived and were working to help the collapsed marchers. The situation was being managed, but she couldn't help thinking about what might have happened if Chen hadn't acted when he did. "Sergeant Chen," she said finally, "you've put me in a very difficult position. On one hand, you clearly violated court procedure and military protocol. On the other hand, your actions may have prevented a much more serious emergency." The courtroom was completely silent as everyone waited for her decision. Margaret realized that whatever she chose would send a message not just to Chen, but to everyone present about how the justice system balances rules with results, procedure with protection of public safety. Judge Thompson took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would shape not only Chen's future, but potentially set a precedent for how her court handled similar situations. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her shoulders as she considered the multiple layers of this unprecedented case. "Sergeant Chen," she began, "I'm going to propose something unusual. Before I make my final ruling on the contempt charges, I want to hear your legal analysis of a hypothetical case." Chen straightened, clearly intrigued by this unexpected turn. "Yes, Your Honor. Imagine you're representing a client who acted outside normal channels to prevent harm to others. The client was technically wrong in his methods, but ultimately right about the danger. How would you argue this case?" Margaret watched as Chen's mind shifted fully into lawyer mode. She could see him organizing his thoughts, considering precedents, and weighing different approaches. When he spoke, his voice carried a new confidence. "Your Honor, I would argue under the defense of necessity, specifically the doctrine of competing harms. My client faced two choices: follow proper procedure and risk harm to innocent people, or violate procedure to prevent that harm. When forced to choose between two wrongs, he chose the lesser one." Margaret nodded, impressed by his quick thinking. "What precedents would you cite?" "Vincent v. Lake Erie Transportation Company established that emergency necessity can justify otherwise illegal actions when the alternative is greater harm." More recently, State v. Morrison held that individuals have a duty to act when they possess special knowledge that could prevent injury to others. The legal spectators in the courtroom were now leaning forward with interest. What had started as a simple disruption case had evolved into an impromptu legal seminar, with Chen demonstrating knowledge that many practicing attorneys would struggle to match. Interesting, Margaret said. Now argue the opposing position. How would the prosecutor respond to your necessity defense? Without missing a beat, Chen shifted perspectives. The prosecution would argue that proper channels existed and that my client's impatience doesn't justify breaking established procedures. They'd cite Thompson v. City Board, which held that emergency exceptions require exhaustion of reasonable alternatives. Margaret was fascinated by Kuhn's ability to argue both sides convincingly. And how would you counter that prosecution argument? I'd demonstrate that the alternatives weren't reasonable given the time constraints. The March coordinator's radio was down. Police supervisor was handling another emergency, and the danger was imminent. The doctrine of impossibility of performance applies when compliance with normal procedures would defeat the very purpose they're meant to serve. The courtroom had become completely quiet. With everyone absorbed in this unusual legal dialogue, Margaret realized that she was witnessing something special, a young mind that could think through complex legal issues with remarkable clarity and maturity. "Sergeant Chen," she said, "you mentioned that you're a third-year law student. What's your class ranking?" Chen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I prefer not to discuss my academic performance in this setting, Your Honor." "I'm not asking to embarrass you," Margaret assured him. "Your legal reasoning suggests someone who excels in his studies. I'm currently ranked second in my class." Chen admitted quietly, "But that's because I have advantages many of my classmates don't have. My military experience has taught me discipline and attention to detail." Margaret felt a growing sense that she was looking at someone destined for significant legal achievement. "What area of law do you plan to practice after graduation?" "Emergency management law, Your Honor. I want to help organizations and governments develop legal frameworks that can respond effectively to crisis situations. Too often, bureaucratic procedures prevent rapid response when lives are at stake." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that Chun's chosen specialty was exactly what had brought him into her courtroom today. "And you see this as your life's calling?" "Yes, ma'am. Military service taught me that protection of civilians is every citizen's responsibility. Legal education is showing me how to build systems that make that protection more effective." Margaret looked out at the scene beyond her windows. The emergency responders had successfully helped the collapsed marchers, and the parade was continuing along a modified route that avoided the problematic bottleneck. The crisis had been managed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Chen's intervention had been crucial in preventing something much worse. "Sergeant," she said, "I want to ask you something personal. When you walked into this courtroom today, did you expect to convince me, or were you simply accepting that you would be arrested for doing what you thought was right?" Chun's answer revealed the depth of his character. "Honestly, Your Honor, I expected to be arrested, but I hoped that even if you held me in contempt, you might still make the phone call to check on the safety situation. I wasn't trying to avoid consequences. I was trying to make sure the right thing happened, even if I paid a price for it." Margaret realized that she was looking at someone who had made a genuine moral choice, weighing the costs and benefits not to himself but to others. This wasn't recklessness or grandstanding. This was principled action taken with full awareness of the personal consequences. "Tell me about your military service," she said. "How long have you served?" 6 years, Your Honor. I enlisted right after high school. Served 2 tours overseas and then requested assignment to the Royal Guards so I could attend law school while maintaining my service. Commitment. And in those 6 years, have you ever been disciplined or faced court-martial proceedings? No, ma'am. This is the first time I've ever been in legal trouble of any kind. Margaret was building a picture of someone whose entire adult life had been characterized by service, discipline, and academic achievement. Today's action wasn't part of a pattern of reckless behavior. It was an exception that seemed to reflect deeper principles about duty and responsibility. Judge Thompson stood up from her bench, a gesture that commanded complete attention from everyone in the courtroom. She had presided over thousands of cases, but she knew that this moment would stand out in her memory for years to come. "Sergeant Chen," she said, "I'm going to do something I've never done in 20 years on the bench. I'm going to ask for input from the people whose lives you've potentially affected today." She turned to address the courtroom. "Is there anyone present who is participating in or watching The Veterans Day March? Several hands went up throughout the courtroom. Margaret pointed to an elderly man in the front row who wore a Vietnam War veteran cap. "Sir, would you please stand and tell us your name?" "Harold Kramer, Your Honor. I was marching with the VFW unit when the problem started at 5th and Main." "What did you observe, Mr. Kramer?" The older man's voice shook slightly as he spoke. "Ma'am, it was getting pretty scary. The crowd was pressed tight. When Tom Phillips collapsed, he's 82 and has a heart condition, people started pushing to try to help. My wife was watching from the sidewalk, and she said she could see the panic starting to spread." Margaret nodded gravely. "In your opinion, could the situation have become worse?" "Oh yes, ma'am. I've seen crowd situations in the service. When people panic, especially in tight spaces, bad things happen fast. If that young sergeant hadn't raised the alarm when he did, I think we could have had a real tragedy." Margaret asked several other march participants to share their observations. Each confirmed that the situation had been deteriorating rapidly and that emergency responders had been unable to reach the affected area quickly due to the route and barrier problems Chen had identified. Then she called on a woman in the middle section. "Ma'am, please state your name and your connection to today's events." "Dr. Sarah Martinez." "Your Honor, I'm an emergency room physician at City General, and I was off duty watching the march with my family. When I saw people collapsing, I tried to help, but I couldn't get through the crowd easily. Dr. Martinez, in your medical opinion, how serious was the situation?" "Very serious, Your Honor. Mr. Phillips was having cardiac symptoms," and Mrs. Chen, no relation to the sergeant, was showing signs of heat exhaustion complicated by crowd stress. In dense crowd situations like that, medical emergencies can quickly become life-threatening if help can't reach the patients quickly. Margaret absorbed this testimony, understanding that Chen's assessment had been not just accurate but potentially life-saving. However, she also knew that good outcomes didn't automatically justify improper procedures. "Sergeant Chen," she said, turning back to him, "you've heard testimony that confirms your safety concerns were valid. Does this change your view of your actions today?" Chen considered the question carefully. "Your Honor, I'm relieved that people weren't seriously hurt, and I'm glad I was right about the danger. But I still believe I should have found a way to work within proper channels, even if it meant taking more risk." This answer surprised many people in the courtroom. Even when vindicated, Chen was still acknowledging the importance of following proper procedures. Margaret found this level of integrity impressive in someone so young. "I want to explore something with you," Margaret said. "In your legal studies, have you examined the tension between individual moral responsibility and institutional authority?" "Yes, ma'am. It's one of the fundamental challenges in legal philosophy. Society needs both individual conscience and respect for established authority to function properly. And how do you balance those competing demands?" Chen's response showed the depth of his thinking. "I believe individuals have a responsibility to work within systems whenever possible, but also an obligation to act on their conscience when those systems fail to protect people. The key is being willing to accept accountability for those choices." Margaret was struck by the maturity of this perspective. Chen wasn't arguing that he was above the law, or that his good intentions excused everything. Instead, he was articulating a thoughtful position about moral responsibility that many seasoned lawyers would struggle to express so. "Clearly, Sergeant," she continued, "let me pose a hypothetical. Suppose I find you in contempt today and impose a significant fine. How would that affect your future legal career?" "It would be a serious mark on my record, Your Honor. Bar admission committees consider all legal proceedings, and contempt of court could raise questions about my fitness to practice law. And knowing that risk, you would still make the same choice today?" Chen's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am. If the alternative was standing by while people potentially got hurt, I would make the same choice." Margaret felt a profound respect for this young man's principles. She had seen many lawyers throughout her career who were brilliant technically, but lacked the moral courage to do difficult things when they mattered. Chen seemed to possess both intellectual ability and ethical strength. "I want to ask you about your future plans," she said. "You mentioned emergency management law. Can you be more specific?" "I want to help create legal frameworks that allow for rapid response, too." emergencies while maintaining proper oversight and accountability. Too often, bureaucratic procedures prevent effective action in crisis situations. But the solution isn't to abandon procedures entirely, it's to design better ones. Margaret realized that Chen's actions today were actually consistent with his career goals. He wasn't just disrupting the system randomly. He was demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that might lead to better emergency response procedures in the future. "Sergeant Chen," she said, "I'm going to make a ruling now, but first I want to say something to everyone in this courtroom. Today we've seen an example of someone who faced an impossible choice between following rules and protecting people. His response demonstrates both the complexity of such situations and the importance of individual moral courage." The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for her decision. Margaret knew that whatever she chose would send a message about how society should handle conflicts between institutional authority and individual conscience. Judge Thompson looked directly at Chen, her expression serious but not unkind. The entire courtroom held its breath as she prepared to deliver her ruling on a case that had evolved far beyond anyone's expectations. "Sergeant David Chen," she began formally, "you have been charged with contempt of court for disrupting legal proceedings. After hearing testimony and evaluating the circumstances, I am prepared to render judgment." Chen stood at attention, accepting whatever consequences were coming with the same dignity he had shown throughout the proceedings. "I find you technically guilty of contempt of court," Margaret continued. "You did interrupt legal proceedings, and you did violate established protocol. However, I also find that your actions were motivated by legitimate concern for public safety, and that your assessment of the emergency situation was accurate and potentially prevented serious harm." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Therefore, I am imposing a fine of $500. Suspended on the condition that you complete 40 hours of community service with the city's emergency management department, helping them review and improve their emergency response procedures." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. This was an unusually creative sentence that acknowledged both Chen's violation and his valuable contribution. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "I am recommending to the State Bar Association that when you apply for admission after graduation, they consider not only today's contempt finding, but also the circumstances that led to it and the positive outcome that resulted from your actions." Chen's composure finally cracked slightly, and Margaret could see tears forming in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down." "I don't think you will," Margaret said. "But I have one more matter to address." She turned to face the entire courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed today illustrates something important about our legal system. Laws and procedures exist for vital reasons. They maintain order, protect rights, and ensure fairness. But they are created and administered by human beings, which means they are imperfect tools serving imperfect people in an imperfect world." The courtroom was completely quiet as Margaret continued her unexpected civics lesson. Sergeant Chen faced a situation where strict adherence to procedure might have resulted in harm to innocent people. His choice to act outside normal channels was legally wrong but morally justified. The challenge for all of us, citizens, lawyers, judges, is to learn from such situations and build better systems that can respond appropriately to genuine emergencies. She looked back at Chen. "Sergeant, your legal education has clearly been excellent. But today, you've received a different kind of education about the real-world application of legal principles. I hope you'll carry both lessons forward in your career." Chen nodded respectfully. "I will, Your Honor, and I hope the community service will help me contribute to better emergency procedures so that future situations like this can be handled more effectively." Margaret was impressed that even now, Chen was thinking about systemic improvements rather than just his own situation. "I have no doubt it will. Mr. Chen, you are hereby released to return to your unit, though I suspect you'll have some explaining to do to your commanding officer." For the first time, Chen smiled slightly. "Yes, ma'am. But I think Colonel Harrison will understand. He was the one who encouraged me to pursue legal education in the first place." As Chen prepared to leave, Margaret had one final thought. "Sergeant, I want to give you some advice for your future legal career. Today you showed excellent legal reasoning, strong moral principles, and the courage to act on your convictions. Those are exactly the qualities our profession needs more of. However," she continued, "you also showed a willingness to work outside established systems when you felt it was necessary. That can be a strength, but it can also get you into trouble. As you move forward, remember that the most effective lawyers are often those who can change systems from within rather than by challenging them from outside." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, Your Honor. I hope to spend my career building legal frameworks that make situations like today's unnecessary." "I believe you will," Margaret said. Court is adjourned. As people began filing out of the courtroom, many stopped to speak with Chen, thanking him for his actions during the march. Margaret watched from her bench. Struck by the genuine respect and gratitude people showed toward this young man who had risked his own future to protect others, Linda approached the bench as the courtroom cleared. "Judge, that was unlike any case I've ever seen you handle." Margaret smiled. "It was unlike any case I've ever had, Linda, but sometimes the law has to adapt to extraordinary circumstances. And sometimes extraordinary people force us to think more deeply about what justice really means." 6 months later, Margaret received a letter from Chen. He had graduated second in his law school class and had been accepted into a prestigious emergency management law program. The city had implemented several of his recommendations for improving emergency response procedures, and the state bar had approved his application for admission without reservation. But what struck Margaret most was the final paragraph of his letter. "Your Honor, I learned something important in your courtroom that day. Real justice isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding the principles behind the rules and applying them thoughtfully to protect people and serve society. Thank you for teaching me that lesson and for showing me that our legal system is flexible enough to recognize good intentions even when they come wrapped in technical violations." Margaret kept that letter in her desk drawer and often thought about it when facing difficult cases. Chen had reminded her that the law, at its best, serves humanity rather than the other way around, and that sometimes the most important legal decisions are the ones that recognize the complexity of real-world moral choices. The case became a teaching example in several law schools, illustrating the tension between individual conscience and institutional authority. But for Margaret, it remained a reminder of why she had chosen to become a judge in the first place, not just to enforce laws, but to ensure that justice served the greater good. Years later, when David Chen had established himself as one of the country's leading experts in emergency management law, he would often tell the story of his day in Judge Thompson's courtroom. He would explain to his students and colleagues how one wise judge had shown him that the law could be both firm and flexible, both principled and practical. The Veterans Day March continued to be held annually, but with improved safety protocols that Chen had helped develop during his community service. The route planning process now included mandatory safety reviews, and emergency response procedures had been streamlined to prevent the kind of communication breakdowns that had occurred that day. Judge Thompson eventually retired after 30 years on the bench, but she always considered the Chen case one of her most important decisions. It had taught her that sometimes the most challenging legal questions aren't found in law books, but in the hearts of people who must choose between competing moral demands. The courtroom where it all happened still stands. And occasionally, law students visit to hear about the case where a royal guard's disruption led to a deeper understanding of justice itself. The story serves as a reminder that our legal system is strongest when it can recognize that following the letter of the law and serving the spirit of justice are not always the same thing, and that the wisest judges are those who can tell the difference.